Welcome, good morning, and a pleasure to be sitting talking to my iPad again. Our series in Luke ends with the end of the world. Chapter 21 is Jesus' teaching on the destruction of the temple and the signs of the end times. The remaining chapters of Luke were mostly covered with our Good Friday and Easter Day readings, so this is a good time to finish the book. We go on to Philippians next week. So find chapter 21. We will be reading some of it and assuming that you have a Bible or a phone on to look at the other verses. This chapter can be confusing and is frequently quoted by confused people looking for ways to predict that the end is nigh. The end is nigh and has been nigh for 2,000 years. I'm asked online if COVID is a sign of the end times. Well, of course it is. Along with thousands of other wake-up calls, God has been reminding us that this world is temporary for 2,000 years. Eternity beckons. We don't live forever on this earth, but the kingdom of God is eternal. This past year has seen floods, wildfires and now a pandemic. Every generation has seen wars and rumours of wars, earthquakes and disease. Death, sword, plague and famine have been continuous since Jesus predicted it would be. The four horses of the apocalypse are riding out continually. The book of Revelation is always relevant to all generations, both in the future, here and now, and has been for 2,000 years. Don't get carried away trying to fit everything we see into biblical prophecy, trying to prove that we are the last generation, because right through history others have been doing the same, and yet here we are today. So let's look at what Luke recorded Jesus is saying. It's very close to Mark chapter 13 and Matthew 24, and it starts off with the widow's offering. What's that got to do with the end of the age? Well, remember, Luke is writing an orderly account. This is absolutely relevant. So let's read it.
As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. "Truly I tell you," he said, "this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she went out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on." Some of the disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down."
Everyone knows this story, but it's seldom taken in context. It is a source of many standalone sermons on giving, but it is the introduction to this crucial teaching about the end times. Other Bibles headline this story as the widow's mite. Mite made it sound like the poor girl had scabies. My big print version calls it the widow's offering. Jesus is in the temple. He's been teaching on paying taxes, marriage, and whose son is the Messiah. And this is the introduction to today's passage. Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honour at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be severely punished, as Jesus looked up. So, he's just warned that the rich devour widows, and he looks up, and he sees a widow. The disciples did not see the widow. They saw the rich putting in their gifts and marvelled at the beautiful stones and the gifts dedicated to God. When we look at the world, what do we see? The disciples saw the rich and the beautiful gifts. Jesus saw the widow doing what is beautiful in God's eyes, and saw the flamboyant but useless temporary gifts of the rich. And he says, it's all going to be destroyed. When you give sacrificially to the kingdom of God, that is of eternal significance. What looks rich and exotic and beautiful in the world's eyes is worthless, and it's not going to last. It's all going to be destroyed. Listen to this from Luke chapter 1, from Mary's song of joy when she visited Elizabeth.
He has performed mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty.
The upside down teaching of Jesus that we see right through Luke. So Jesus says, yes, I see these beautiful gifts and the beautiful stones from other men's gifts, but I'm telling you, this is not part of my kingdom. The time is coming when it will all be destroyed. When will these things happen, they ask? And what will be a sign they're about to take place? And then it gets very complicated, because there are two questions and two answers all mixed up. Verses 8 to 11.
He replied, "Watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and uprisings, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines and pestilences in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven."
Wars and rumours of wars, famines, pandemics and fearful events. It's going to happen. It's already happened many times throughout history. Far worse than what we are seeing now. The 1918 flu killed 50 million people. As a percentage of the world's population, this virus hasn't even got started. HIV has killed more than 50 million people. Now, with COVID, the world panics. The church says, hey, Jesus told us this would happen. It's not the end. Let's look at the last verse. There will be great earthquakes, famines and pestilence, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. Now this is explained further in verse 25. There will be signs in the sun, moon and stars. On the earth nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Jesus said, but before all this. Let's read 12 to 19.
"But before all this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison. And you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. And so you will bear testimony to me. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but not a hair of your head will perish. Stand firm, and you will win life."
Okay, what's all this about? Hand you over to synagogues. Synagogues? I don't know any synagogues. Who cares what they think anyway? It's pretty obvious that this is something that's going to happen to his disciples very soon, while synagogues were still an issue. You will be brought before kings and governors. Does kings and governors mean the Roman Empire, or does it mean courts and nations for all time. Let's come back to that. In verse 16, they will put some of you to death. And then in verse 18, but not a hair of your head will perish. I suppose some will see this as total contradiction. You mean I die, but my hair keeps growing? But those who understand poetry will recognise what Jesus means here. Those who die because of him will not perish, but live forever in eternity with God. Perish here means the total eternal destruction that happens to those who die rejecting Jesus. Let's go on, verses 20 to 24.
When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment in fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land, and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled.
This is very clear. This is about the beautiful stones. This is what Jesus meant by, but before all this, before the great signs from heaven, before the signs in the sun, moon and stars and the roaring and tossing of the sea, this is not about the end of the world and the second coming. It's about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. It happened. It's history. It was in 70 AD. Jesus is making a very specific prophecy about the temple stones being thrown down. Now, those who deny prophecy say the gospel writers are deceiving us. They are reporting Jesus telling us about something that's already happened. These books were written after 70 AD, but look at the evidence. This obviously had not happened when Luke was writing his gospel. Why? Because the book of Acts begins with the words, "In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus had begun to do." Now, Acts, Luke's second book, finishes with Paul in prison in Rome just after his trial in Jerusalem. So the Jews had not yet rebelled, because Paul could not have been appearing before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem if the rebellion had already started. The siege of Jerusalem went on for years. So clearly Luke's Gospel, his first book, and Acts, his second book, had both been written and circulated well before 70 AD. And history tells us that the Christians at that time read what Matthew, Mark and Luke had written, saw what was happening and did exactly what Jesus said. They got out of the city and fled to the mountains. The destruction of Jerusalem has been described as the most awful disaster ever seen before or since. It's estimated 3 million were in Jerusalem when the Romans surrounded the city, and only 90,000 survived. Mosul, Aleppo and Idlib, Berlin don't even come close. This is history. They were indeed taken as prisoners to all the nations. No wonder Jesus wept as he came into Jerusalem as king. Rosie, read 19, chapter 41 to 44.
As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, If you had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you onto the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you.
And that is exactly what happened 40 years later. Some of his listeners would have been still alive. People did live into their 80s back then. They would have seen what was happening and remembered Jesus' words and legged it into the mountains. So, verses 12 to 24, from before all this to Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles, is the answer to the disciples' questions about not one stone will be left upon another. When will these things happen? It happened exactly as Jesus taught 40 years later. So now Jesus moves on to the second half of what he is teaching, the signs of the end of the age. If you're in a group or a family, this is a good place for a break. Make yourself some coffee, maybe read those verses again in Matthew 24 and see how this first section is the answer to one of the questions, the destruction of the temple, and the rest is an answer to the second question, the signs of the end of the age. We continue, Rosie, verses 25 to 28.
There will be signs in the sun, moon and stars. On the earth nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud, with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near.
Clearly, this has not happened. We have not seen any heavenly bodies shaken. We had a beautiful full moon earlier this week and it was not shaking. We have seen tsunamis, but that doesn't really equate to the nations being in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. The prophecy about Jerusalem happened exactly as Jesus described. We can be sure that the second half of this prophecy will also happen exactly as Jesus described. For a second time in Luke, he says how people can know that summer is coming from looking at the fig tree. And he goes on to say, look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. This generation clearly does not mean the people in the temple listening to him. They lived to see the first prophecy, but not the second. The destruction of Jerusalem was before all this. Now he is talking about the future. The generation that sees these things will be the end time generation. It is not going to be ongoing, continual for thousands of years. When the heavenly bodies are shaken and the sea is roaring like the nations have never seen before, that generation will see the final end. This is repeated by John in the book of Revelation. There will be continued warnings throughout history, continued seals, bowls of wrath and trumpets over and over. But the final seal, the final bowl, the seventh trumpet will be one generation. And the final end will not be that predictable to the people of the world either. They will still be weighed down by life. They will still be carousing and getting drunk right up to the end. Verses 34 to 35.
Be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life. And that day will close on you suddenly like a trap. For it will come on all those who live on the face of the whole earth. Be always on the watch and pray.
On all people on the face of the whole earth. Nothing to do with Jerusalem. Forget stories and fiction and films about the modern Jerusalem and battles in the Middle East. It's irrelevant. The final warning is to the whole world. The whole world will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud and great glory. So what's the message to us? Like almost all Christians born since 70 AD, we have seen that Jesus' prophecy about Jerusalem happened exactly as described, and we can be sure the second prophecy will happen exactly as described too. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is reported to say, "When you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, then flee to the mountains." This happened. The rebellion was kicked off by the Romans sacrificing a pig in the temple. Jews would have understood this. Luke's Gentile readers would not, so maybe that's why Luke leaves that bit out. The important point for us is that everything Jesus prophesies is already in the Old Testament prophecies. We can read Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah about the end of the age, often called that day. Started off by the coming of the Messiah, then the destruction of the Jewish kingdom, and the coming of Jesus' kingdom, the son of David's kingdom, that will last forever. And here Jesus tells us, do not be deceived. Ignore people claiming to come in his name, saying the time is near. When you hear of wars and uprisings, do not be frightened. These things must happen, but the end will not come right away. But when it does, it'll be as obvious to us from the signs as it is from the fig tree getting leaves showing that summer is near. Jesus is very specific. Just as he was about the destruction of a temple, there will be signs in the sun, moon and stars. They will be shaken, and the whole world perplexed by the roaring of the sea, and they will faint from terror. We haven't seen that yet. When it comes, we will know that that generation will not pass away before it is finished. Meanwhile, the world will continue to sin and be anxious about things that don't matter. Be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life, and that day will close on you suddenly like a trap. So what about us? Very clear. Do not be deceived. Do not be frightened. Pray that you will be able to stand before the Son of Man. Be like the widow, putting her tiny offering into the temple, giving all she had. Let's get our priorities right, not being led astray by the grotesque public displays of wealth of the rich, not impressed by the wonders of the world, not frightened by the signs of the end, instead giving all we have to God. Pray, knowing that Jesus died for us, that those who have accepted his righteousness to reconcile them with God, we will be able to stand before the Son of Man. Be always on the watch and pray that you will be able to escape all that is about to happen, and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man.